Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining the ShareGate webinar today. I'm thrilled for the great topic we will be covering today. Before that, I know there's always a lot of questions around the webinar, such as, will the webinar be recorded today? Absolutely, yes. The webinar will be recorded today, and we will make it available and send it to everyone that registered as soon as it's out, likely early next week. So stay tuned. Today, we're very excited to be talking about protecting your team's work across Office 365 with Joanne Klein, an MVP of Microsoft and a Microsoft Ignite speaker a couple of weeks ago. I don't know anyone better to talk about this topic as it covers a number of areas that we want to look into. If at any point in time during this webinar, you have a question, myself as well as my colleagues here at the ShareGate office in Montreal, we're ready. Simply click on the Q&A box at the bottom and we will try to answer as fast as possible. We'll make sure that we cover as much, otherwise it'll be available in the recording and blog that will follow next week. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Joanne Klein. Again, thanks for accepting to take this topic here at the ShareGate webinar today. We're thrilled, and I'll let you introduce yourself.
All right. Thanks for the intro, Ben. Hi, everybody. I'm Joanne Klein, and it's my pleasure to be with you over the next 40 minutes or so talking about this very important topic, protecting your team's work across Office 365. I'm an independent consultant and I work with customers focusing on really the data protection and data governance aspects of teamwork across Office 365. So I'm hoping to share a lot of my observations and findings and learnings from that experience with you today. So the agenda for today is going to be pretty simple. I'm going to start talking about the root concerns, some common concerns people have, the shared responsibility model. However, the bulk of today's presentation is going to be around these things I have highlighted because those are concentrating on the actual controls you can implement in your environment to protect your teamwork. Now, I want to start with a quote from Caruana Gatimu. Now, she is the customer advocacy group lead in Microsoft Teams. And I love this quote because I believe this is the balance we're all striving to reach. And it's a lot easier said than done to implement those governance controls while still enabling a great collaboration experience. So this is a goal I think we should all have and likely all do. So I'm going to talk about some specific things we can do to get us a little bit closer to this utopia. Some common concerns I hear, I'm thinking they probably align with what you're hearing as well, is site sprawl is a concern. Some intellectual property is perhaps going to be lost. Some sensitive information might be, inadvertently shared outside of the company. These are all real and legitimate concerns. So let's dig into some of those. This is a very challenging problem, and these are some numbers I heard at the recent Microsoft Ignite conference, and they're really demonstrate how widespread this concern is. 88% of organizations no longer having confidence that they can detect and prevent loss of the sensitive data they have. And a lot of that corporate data is what we call dark. So it's not, monitored or classified or tightly controlled and understood. And that's a good part of our corporate data. And the number one concern done by a Microsoft GDPR research is definitely complying with regulations. So these are real problems and they can't be dealt using manual means or by just hiring more people to address this problem. We really need to leverage AI and automation to address this problem at scale. And we need to approach it really in a proactive manner rather than a reactive manner. And a lot of the controls that are implemented in Office 365 are approaching it in that way. which I think is really setting us up for being able to get our organizations towards that compliant picture. However, just like not all data is equal, not all teams are created equal. For instance, whether you're talking about a corporate level, maybe intranet level area of collaboration where it's kind of a one-to-many broad conversation, down a little bit lower where you have a few people communicating out to larger audiences, and then down to what I call those transient groups. So this can be a combination of Microsoft Teams, Yammer, or SharePoint. Teamwork can be contained within all of those workloads. Lots of cross collaboration happens there. So you can't paint all of these types of teams and all of the type of data that's contained in those teams with one broad brush. It often takes a much more targeted focus and targeted application of some of these controls at any one particular point in time. So instead of really looking at your data the same way across everything, this is where tapping into your classification system through sensitivity labels and making that more contextual for where you're at makes a lot of sense, and how I think organizations are going to be able to get ahead of this problem of all of this dark data that is out there. However, there are some competing demands and requirements across most organizations. The business, they want to, of course, accomplish their business goals as simply as possible with the tools that you provide them and without little disruption. Employees just want to get their job done quickly. They don't want you to kind of impede their collaboration experience, but they want their stuff protected when it's sensitive in nature. IT admins, this is the group that implements the technical controls. They really have, in some cases, a challenging job to keep up with the changing services in Office 365 and the increasing threat that is in front of us. It's only getting smarter and only getting more advanced, so we really need to keep ahead of that. Of course, the legal, compliance, governance, risk, all of those business teams that are focused on the governance aspect and the protection aspect of the data, they have their own set of concerns, as well as security officers protecting against data breaches and that high value information. So these are all, in some cases, competing priorities and competing requirements they have against each other. So one way of addressing this is what Microsoft calls the shared responsibility model. And this makes a lot of sense when you think about it. Because there's so many updates happening all the time against whatever kind of regulatory body your particular organization has to adhere to, Microsoft, is bringing in these new regulations, and they say a way of kind of keeping up with that is to leverage the shared responsibility model. By that, they mean you as an organization are responsible for protecting the data, the identities, and the devices within your organization, whereas Microsoft vigorously protects the Office 365 services. So together, you can protect your data. That makes sense. However, within your own organization, there's also a coordinated effort that has to go on. You have to get your own, I call it your own electronic house in order with the controls that you have. And this takes a coordinated effort of, I believe, 3 key groups. First one is the biggest group, and that would be the people working on your teamwork, creating the content, some of them sharing with external parties, some of them working with sensitive information. This group really needs to understand how to work safely and securely inside a modern workplace today. It's a new skill. I believe it's incumbent upon us in IT to teach them these skills, in addition to putting the controls on, but controls alone will not be able to do that. Then there's the IT teams, which are the resources that implement the technical controls involved in some of the training and configuration. And last, but certainly not least, is the groups that you need to help define your classification system across your environment, legal risk, compliance, governance, internal audit, all of those types of regulatory teams. Now, this group of business teams are in a unique position because they really understand the organization's duty to preserve some of this information and protect it beyond its immediate business value, which is what the information workers are looking at. So we need to lean into those business groups to help us in IT define what it is we have to secure and protect. So you need to bring them in from the start. Today, for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to approach this from a perspective of governance, and I firmly believe this is how this needs to be managed. And I'm particularly going to focus in on, because there's more than one type of governance, that's a very broad term, but container and content governance is key when you're talking about teamwork, security governance, of course, and then a little bit on discovery governance. But to be clear, all of these work together to have a governed and compliant environment end to end. I saw this example in some Microsoft Teams sessions I went to at Ignite, and I loved this approach. So to demonstrate some of the controls I'm about to talk about, I'm going to have 3 examples of 3 different types of organizations, just kind of one extreme to the other, and hopefully you'll be able to identify with one of the 3 or a combination of the 3. So John is working in an IT department at a bank, and they use restrictive settings. Kate works in IT department at Contoso, and they like to strike that perfect balance between user freedom and IT control. And then Chad at Tailspin Toys is in IT, and they like to drive productivity by removing as many barriers as possible. Odds are your organization isn't, specifically in one of these 3, but it's to demonstrate the different controls and how different organizations can look at those controls to suit their organizational culture, regulatory requirements, and compliance needs. So for instance, provisioning a new team, let's say, how would these 3 personas address this? So John in the bank might say we could completely control site provisioning with a strict approval process, and we automate the controls for external access, we strictly have naming conventions, and apply the appropriate protection. Kate, they leverage standard site designs for their users, but they allow them to provision them without approval, and then they follow up after the fact for additional guidance and controls. Chad, they just use the out-of-the-box provisioning features. End users know what they want, and they don't want to get in their way. So as you can see, 3 quite different approaches to site provisioning. None of them are wrong. None of them are perfectly right. It just depends what is right for your organization and your environment. And that is up to you to make that path for your own organization. Okay, so let's start with container and content governance. In here, I want to focus on protecting your teamwork, particularly your sensitive teamwork, and retaining your teamwork. 2 specific things that anybody in those business teams and those compliance areas will definitely be focused on. So I like to think of container and content governance kind of in these 4 pillars. And all of the things I mention in here should likely be addressed in your own organization. And I'm going to touch not on all of them because we don't have that much time today, but I'm going to focus on 4 or 5 of these. The key one is requiring classifications for your containers. That is the underpinning for absolutely everything else in managing and protecting and securing your Office 365 teamwork. Data loss prevention is another tool. It's been around for a while, but they're continuing to evolve that tool with the new modern team collaboration options that are out there. Protecting your assets, that's where retention options come into play. Conditional access is what do you do when you have unmanaged devices coming in to access your teamwork. Rights management, do you need to encrypt any of your content? And then, of course, external membership, which is something we are all faced in our organizations today. No longer, are you contained within your own firewall. It's completely commonplace to be collaborating with an external partner or vendor or customer on something. So we need to have controls in place to make sure we can do that securely. So protecting your sensitive teamwork, really, we want to do this wherever it lives. That's the strength, I believe, of these controls. Whether you're talking about an Exchange email or a Microsoft Team conversation or a file that's sitting in SharePoint, we want to protect it wherever that lives and on whatever device you may be accessing it from. The first thing you need to do, and you will probably involve those business teams in your governance departments, is define your own organizational classification scheme. That's key to everything. Then understand your data landscape. Where does your sensitive data live? What are users doing with it, and why it may be at risk? Are they sharing that routinely with external parties? You really need to have a handle on the activity and what's being done in your own environment. And then we can start to apply sensitivity labels based on your classification system to help identify and protect your data. In this case, your teamwork. And we can also leverage data loss prevention to govern your sensitive data as well. So first thing kind of to take away from this is there's more than one control at play at any point in time. And in fact, it's a number of controls that work together to really increase and improve your security and your protection posture. So I'm sharing this classification scheme with you because this is Microsoft's classification scheme. And I find, not that everybody needs to do the same as them, but I find it fascinating because Microsoft, of course, is a very large organization. And the fact that they were able to pare down their classification scheme to 4 classifications is impressive. And a few takeaways from this I want to highlight. And one is the words are very clear to understand. There's no ambiguity between one term and the next, which is critical because your end users, your information workers sitting in front of the keyboard, sometimes having to make the call on whether something is confidential or highly confidential, they really need to understand what that difference is. It's critical to do it in terms that everybody across your whole organization is going to be able to understand. As much as the automated controls are coming into play, there will always be a need for a manual setting of some of these classification systems. So to me, that's the takeaway from Microsoft's classification scheme. Now, once you have your classification scheme, many things follow on after that. And one is sensitivity labels. These can do things like content markings. And by that, I mean a watermark on your document. Maybe it's a top secret document, a header and a footer. They can apply protection or encryption on a document. They can apply rights management. So on that little image I have shown there is as granular as you can get on some of these sensitivity labels. You can prevent someone from printing something if they want, for instance, which is perhaps something you would want to do on a top secret document. And you can automate this or recommend it based on this sensitive information type. This is license dependent, of course, and because I typically get license questions, for most of the things I talked about today, I did include a license slide at the end of the presentation for you to refer back. Note, though, that that is a point in time. Licensing may change, product features may change. So as of right now, that's what the licensing options are.
An excellent point, if you may. The licensing is a big key to all of these. There was something interesting earlier. You talked about securing or container governance. And I know it's something that came up, and I was wondering if you could describe what you mean by container governance before we continue on with these labels that we can add on to it for people that are looking into this.
Sure. Yeah, good point. When I am referring in the scope of teamwork, when I say container governance, I am talking about the SharePoint site, let's say, or the Microsoft team, or the Exchange mailbox. I'm talking about what is it that you can manage and how the controls that are in Office 365, at what level are they kind of published to? So in sensitivity labels, it actually can be published at a couple of different levels. What I'm showing here can be published right down to the targeted document or email if you want. Now, there's some new announcements that Ignite I'm going to talk about in a little bit further, where you can now also apply it at a higher container level. So you can apply a sensitivity setting to an entire Microsoft Teams or an entire SharePoint site if you want to. So the beauty of that is everything within that container inherits that same sensitivity setting by default. All right, so the end user experience with these sensitivity labels, these are 3 little GIFs I put on this page just to demonstrate what they are. Office apps up in the top, I'm in a Word document there, and you can see I'm setting sensitivity of a document to confidential. On the bottom left is Outlook on the web, and on the right, I have an iPhone, so this is iOS. A couple things I want to point out here. One is they're the same sensitivity label options on all 3. This is unified across all platforms. This is derived from the data classification of my organization. So whatever your classifications that your governance teams come up with, it is going to show across all these environments, which is point again that these have to be very clearly understood, because end users are going to be presented with these on many times. And in the middle, I'm just pointing out, rolling out right now, I don't have it yet, but Office for the web will have these same options as well. So if you're in Word Online, you'll be able to set the sensitivity setting in there as well. So I really like how Microsoft is integrating these sensitivity settings right within the products. All right. Now, you can also set this at a container level, in this case, a site level, and these are the exact same classifications. So I'm setting this Board of Directors site to highly confidential. Now, I'm going to go to the site, and where you will see this classification is up near the top, right by the site name. And if you click that, you can set this up so it goes to a URL. In my case, I always recommend set up a page on your governance site, because everybody here should have one, right? On explaining what all your sensitivity classifications mean. That's an end user assist for you. We really need to make sure end users understand these settings.
100%. I often hear or see people talking about governance directly jump to a 27-page PDF or Word that Microsoft has a template. And ultimately, governance is trying to guide users to good use of the platform, and nothing better than to help them quickly get the information they need. And the SharePoint site can definitely do that. 100% agree. Love to see what you've done there for site sensitivity usage guidelines.
Yeah, awesome. I agree. It needs to be quick, snappy. They just want to get in, get out, make the decision on what the sensitivity is, and continue on with their work. Awesome. This was announced at Ignite, and I'm super excited about it. What I just showed you in the SharePoint Admin Center for setting a sensitivity at a SharePoint site, you'll now be able to hook more controls into that sensitivity setting to affect the site container. The first is determining the privacy option for that sensitivity label, private or public. Will you by default allow external users? So perhaps if a site is labeled confidential, you will not allow external user access. That's a decision you could make at the sensitivity level. Unmanaged devices. This is where conditional access comes into play. If you have a confidential site, will you allow devices that are unmanaged access into it, or will it be limited such that they have to use the online versions of the Office products and not the desktop clients? So this is a decision you can make right at the sensitivity label setting, which is another fantastic addition to sensitivity labels in Office 365. This is announced at Ignite as a public preview and is rolling out by the end of the year. Okay, for those of you in the audience who have used a protected document using information rights management, you will likely have noticed this when you're trying to share a document with somebody and they try to open it. This is what they will get in the online versions of the Office products. Microsoft has now fixed this. They are treating encrypted documents as first-class citizens, which means you will be able to open and edit it directly in Office Online, which is fantastic. Here again, increasing that or improving that collaboration experience for the end users. You'll now be able to co-author in there, and they will be searchable, which has follow-on effects for data loss prevention can now leverage these, and as well as eDiscovery can find them. This was announced at Ignite as well. And something called auto-labeling files at rest in SharePoint. If you have some documents that are not labeled, which let's face it, is going to happen quite a bit, soon there will be an auto-labeling feature for those documents, and they will be labeled automatically, which will be great. And you will be able to see that there's a sensitivity column in SharePoint, and you will be able to see that value there. And as far as I know right now, it's going to be based on sensitive information types, but that likely will expand over time. Okay, so that was sensitivity labels. Want to go on to talk about data loss prevention. This is another way, another kind of way of preventing exposure of your sensitive information. Maybe you are trying to share a health services number with somebody external to your own organization, and you don't want that to happen. So this is a tool you can use for that. You can allow an end user to override it, and it can detect certain things. So I talked about a health services number that would be considered a sensitive information type. In Office 365, there's many built-in sensitive information types. I want to say around 100, but I might have lost count. You can base this off of retention labels. You could also do it through Azure Information Protection labels or sensitivity labels before through PowerShell, but soon you'll be able to do that through the UI as well, which is really, really good, because if you have both, it's double the protection, and you do need both. Here's an example of what this looks like to an end user. So on the left, there's an email message, and they're trying to share. This is a custom sensitive information type that I've built into this tenant. Customer BB-4444. So it detects that and gives a policy tip in line saying who you're trying to send this to is external. You aren't allowed to send this information. Oh, sorry. And on the right-hand side is a share I'm trying to do with somebody external again on a document that contains sensitive information. So it's built into the end user experience, really trying to prevent them from accidentally or inadvertently trying to share information. However, here's an example of a tool that's been around for a while, and they're now bringing in some new workloads to it. In this case, Microsoft Teams. So DLP is now integrated with Microsoft Teams to block sensitive content when it's being shared. So this includes both users that have guest access or external access. And I'm going to talk about the difference between those two in a few slides from now, but know that it will detect that. So I've got another GIF here, and I'm in a channel conversation with an external user, and I'm sharing a social insurance number. It's detected that, and it's blocked it. So I can click the what can I do, and in this case, because the DLP policy has been configured to allow this, I can override it and give it a reason, which that's a terrible reason, by the way, but it will allow that to be sent. So on the bottom left, you can see what the recipient of that chat message would see if in fact it was blocked and I didn't override it. So it would say there's sensitive content, this can't be shared. This works in both the Teams desktop client and the Teams web app, by the way. So great feature to enable in your environment, particularly if you're using Microsoft Teams. Just want to show this roadmap was shared with me at Ignite, and I want to key in on 3 particular things on the right-hand side that I'm excited about that relate specifically to protecting your teamwork. And one is blocking anonymous access for sensitive files. So if you've identified them as sensitive, we can make sure that there is no way you can anonymously share those files. I talked about enforcing those DLP controls based on a sensitivity label. And another one I love is treating brand new files as sensitive by default in SharePoint Online until they're scanned. One thing I didn't explain is how DLP works is it works on a scanning mechanism, so it's not immediate. So the risk with that is you could upload a sensitive document, and between the moment that you do that and the moment that it's scanned by DLP, there is a period of time in which you could share that. So this will kind of prevent that, or that's a stopgap, and prevent that from happening. So I think that's great. So if it's not clear by now, I think it should be, and that is really our role as IT administrators and as business teams working in the compliance area is we need to strike a really good balance between data security and enabling productivity in our environment. So I won't go through all of these, but you can see in some cases they're competing priorities, but data security, we should try to enable all of these things and then assist the productivity side as much as we can, but still try to integrate these controls so it doesn't impede them any more than we absolutely have to. Okay, so if we go back to our personas, we can talk about how these 3 would protect their sensitive content. So John at the bank, they may automatically apply sensitivity labels to their content and require users to provide a reason for override. And they definitely use DLP across all of their locations. Kate, they allow their users to collaborate freely with external users. However, they are currently monitoring when sensitive information is being shared to build their DLP policies. So another thing I didn't talk about on DLP is you can test out your policies ahead of time. The advantage of doing that is you can see how much and who is sharing sensitive data. And based on those analytics, you can adjust and fine-tune your DLP policies before you actually turn them on live across your environment. And Chad at Tailspin Toys, they apply a default sensitivity label, which is something you can do. That's an easy place to start. But they rely on their end users to adjust it if necessary, and they definitely allow external sharing on all of their sites. So in Chad's case, it would be incumbent upon him and his IT team to make sure the end users really understood those sensitivity label settings so they could change them when they needed to. But 3 very different perspectives on the exact same controls. Okay, retention. So now that you're protecting your teamwork. The information management and record management teams in your organization are going to be looking at this with an eye of retaining the records out of those teams. And at a high level, they'll want to do one of three things. One is retain, and that retention policies and retention labels can both do these three things. So you may want to retain something for a minimum of 5 years, let's say. They can both retain and delete in one definition. So an example there is retaining customer information for 10 years and then deleting it after a review. And then maybe not so obvious, but they might just want to outright delete some content. So maybe you want to delete team collaboration content 8 years after it's last modified. Although I've not seen an organization do that one yet, but that is definitely an example. The idea behind retention in Office 365 is it's built-in compliance. It's retaining in place. It's not moving the content out to an external archive to retain it. In some cases, it may move to a different site, but it doesn't move it out of Office 365, which has an advantage of still making that content discoverable within Office 365. Information workers can still find it. There's an audit trail of everything that's gone on with the document. There's many advantages to leaving it under the Office 365 umbrella. So I put this little grid together on the team workloads on the, like small t team workloads on the left-hand side, and what a retention policy can retain and what a retention label can retain. They're slightly different from each other, and there's some things one can do that the other can't do. I would just want to point out on Microsoft Teams chat and channel messages, a retention policy can be published to those workloads. Currently, a retention label cannot. And a requirement I see in some organizations is a one-day retention is now allowed on team chat messages. It used to be, I believe, a minimum of 30 days. So that gives you, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, while we're looking at these different workloads and where it's applied, there was two questions I thought actually very interesting, which was, if we want to classify and protect our data on cross Office 365 services, we don't need to install Azure Information Protection on client user PCs, right?
The answer to that is it depends on, there's two clients that you can pick. If you're going to, there's the traditional Azure Information Protection. You can migrate them to sensitivity labels. I'm talking about the sensitivity labels today that you configure from the Security and Compliance Center. Once you have them, there's two different ways you can leverage or use them in your clients. One is an add-in to your Office clients, and the other is built into the Office install. So either one of them will work. They do have different capabilities depending on which one you're using though.
Sounds good. And then one last one for what is the difference between sensitivity labels or the relationship between sensitivity labels and permissions management, which can be applied at various levels?
A sensitivity label is always applied at the document level, like a one document or an email level. Whereas what was the other one they asked about?
Basically permissions management and the sensitivity labels. Why one or the other or both, or what's the relationship between both of them?
Well, you can set certain permission management. That was that little screen I had up there where you can control at a very granular level the permissions for a sensitivity label: view, edit, print, etc. So that's optional. You certainly don't have to do that, but it's an additional level of control and protection you can associate with a sensitivity label if that is shared externally. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, I want to try to explain at a high level kind of the three ways of applying retention to demonstrate a point that speaks back to all of the corporate dark data that organizations are concerned with. One is you can certainly manually apply a retention label. Information workers, it's just like associating a piece of metadata to a document, and you can do that, or an email. You can automatically apply it. I just finished a 20-minute theater session at Ignite where I talked about 7 ways you can auto-apply a retention label to a piece of content. But you can also, announced at Ignite, use machine learning. And this, I think, is a game changer for retention across Office 365. And in fact, it's really the only way, in my opinion, that you're going to be able to manage this at scale. And it's using a new technique, machine learning, to be able to go across everything that you either haven't manually or automatically applied a label with and associate a retention to it. So these are the 7 ways I talked about at Ignite. But number 8, and the one that's using machine learning, is Trainable classifiers. Not available yet, it's in public preview, but it will be a game changer and really, really smart way of identifying content across your organization and then applying retention to it. What I'm showing you here is the 6 built-in classifiers that are going to come to every tenant, and you can certainly leverage those, but you can also build your own classifiers. So it's a fairly involved process, of course. Get a sample of data, kind of identify what your classifier looks like, feed some positives and some negatives into it so it learns what your classifier looks like, and then kind of send it out across all of your data in your organization to identify it and then take action on it. And the action you can take on it is apply a retention label, which is what I love about this. So there's going to be a 3rd option on this list. Right now, there's only the top 2, but soon we're going to be able to apply a retention label to any content that matches one of these classifiers. And what's even better yet is you'll be able to associate a classifier with a sensitivity label. So when you're setting this up, you'll be able to say anything with the classifier of, if we use resumes, make sure it's identified as sensitive. And this is rolling out into preview by end of year. So I'm anxious to get my hands on that. So if we go back to our scenario, retaining our teamwork, what would those 3 personas do for this? So John at the bank, they would have retention labels fairly closely aligned to their file plan to retain regulated content, and they would probably have disposition review on a lot of their content. By that I mean they need to approve the deletions before they happen, which is very common in regulated industries. They have retention policies on their team chat and channel messages as well. Kate, they have retention policies published across their collaboration locations, including Microsoft Teams. That is transparent to their end users, but it still allows it to be discoverable. That is one key difference between retention label and retention policy. A retention policy happens behind the scenes, either in the recoverable items partition in Exchange or in the preservation whole library in SharePoint. An end user really has no idea that it's going on. And Chad at Tailspin Toys, they have a few retention labels for their most valuable content, but they rely on their end users to manually apply them.
Has your experience been that you require dedicated people for what's in the security and compliance center? Or is this something that we can do one time is set up? What would you recommend to John, Kate, and Chad's company to do?
I would say, particularly in John's and likely in Kate's, they require dedicated resources. Now, you might have, depending on the size of your organization, you might have one role that's doing a number of things in there, but each of these things I'm talking about is a significant piece in the Security and Compliance Center and requires, a lot of care and attention in order to not only configure it initially, but to audit, what's going on, how it's being used across your organization, get some insights into that, and then adjust. So yeah, it it in some cases takes a team of people to really keep the wheel spinning behind the scenes.
Thank you.
I saw this saying at Ignite and I absolutely loved it. So even if you have all of your controls in place and you left work yesterday at 5 p.m. when you come in this morning, do you really have a handle on where your data is? And that chances are, unless you've used some of these AI and automation controls, I would say you probably can't answer that yes. So it demonstrates the point. You really need to be monitoring, constantly adjusting, leveraging these AI and automation to manage this at scale. So label analytics is one place within the Security and Compliance Center that you can see and have visibility into the volume and location of the sensitive and business critical information and what kind of activities are going on there. It's really, I believe, can help refine those protection and governance policies you have in place. This is where the rubber hits the road and you can see what users are actually doing. So for example, on the retention label side, you can see what retention labels they're using and what workloads they're using it against. On the sensitivity label side, you can see what sensitivity labels are being used and the types of locations that they're being used on. So there again, further to Ben's point, somebody needs to be looking at these things and taking action on them when there's something that needs to be addressed or adjusted. All right, security governance. This is collaborating with external users securely. So there's two kinds of, I call them externals, particularly in Microsoft Teams is what I'm going to focus on. But to be clear, at the top, there's many levels that you can configure external access, from Azure AD level to the team level, at the group level, and at SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business. This graphic is mostly looking at Microsoft Teams. External access is basically giving control to an entire domain or to have access into your environment, or blocking an entire domain. Okay, so it would give users access to find, call, chat, and set up meetings with you. It does not give them access to a team and to be a member of a team. That is called guest access. They're both administered in the Teams Admin Center, but they're very different types of users and access. So guest access would be when you invite an external member into a team and you're chatting with them in a channel conversation. And they can have, varying levels of controls, and you can, this is where those that DLP example I talked to you about before, that would show up in this case as well, if you had a guest access user. The thing I love about this, if organizations are a little leery or hesitant to bring in external guests or external access into their environment, is one key benefit of allowing them in is if your organization is collaborating with them anyway, at least if the data is kept in your tenant, you can protect it. You can monitor it, you have control of it, and that is a much better place to be than if you don't allow external users and your information workers find a way to somehow collaborate with them outside of your sanctioned tools. Maybe send them a copy of a document or whatever. So to me, this is a critical piece to really enabling secure and compliant collaboration within your environment. So I've just got some things about allowing it, some recommendations, and what features are coming soon on both sides. On the guest access side, you'll soon be able to, I demonstrated that, disable guest access at a team site level. Let's say you have a confidential or a top secret team site. I can see completely you will not allow guest access on that. On the external access side, you can soon be able to automatically expire external user access, which is another good thing. So my recommendations for external sharing. So up in the top right are the options you have for external sharing. and some recommendations for that. I love the approach of number one, enable external sharing by default, but disable based on classification. The example I just gave, disable it if it's a confidential site, for instance. Limit domains as required. Really educate your end users on the importance of sharing, how to share. Do not send a copy of a document, share. Make sure you have those controls in place so they are comfortable doing that and they can share when they need to. New will be the ability to use data loss prevention to prevent anyone links from SharePoint OneDrive for Business for sensitive documents, which is another good thing. And again, getting back to Ben's comment about how many people do you need in that Security and Compliance Center, you need to make security audits part of your governance process, and that means somebody in there monitoring those things on a daily basis, seeing what's going on. So our three personas, John would be very selective on who they collaborate with, and they only allow certain external domains in their environment. Kate allows her users to collaborate with external users. However, they prevent guest users because they're still figuring things out. And Chad, they allow communication with any external parties because they don't want to impede their users' ability to do more. All right, the last one is discovery governance and the discoverability of your teamwork. So this is talking about e-discovery, basically, which is using this e-discovery model. It's just a description of how e-discovery works. It starts at that identification phase and goes all the way over to presentation phase. So it's searching against all of your teamwork content, okay? It can search against all of those workloads and find content relevant to the e-discovery case. Reason I want to point out this diagram is it demonstrates the precursor to e-discovery is all of the information governance controls we've talked about up to this point in time. So you need to do a good job on that information governance piece before your legal teams come in and start their e-discovery process. It's very quickly, lots of neat things you can do in an e-discovery and a few new announcements at Ignite. Particular one I want to point out is the ability to reconstruct a team's conversation in advanced e-discovery. It gives you the context of the conversation and discover a user's teams automatically, which becomes really important if you're, let's say, investigating an end user in your organization and you want to search against all of their teams. There's now facility to do that automatically. And great news, e-discovery will be available for those that use Yammer for the content that's stored in there as well. So just a quick visual of what that Teams message discovery looks like. So if we had this Teams conversation going on, it would look like this in e-discovery. So you can see the context of the conversation, which is critical to a legal team when they're trying to understand the meaning of a particular conversation. So that's key. Okay, so that's the end, but I've got a couple takeaways from today. Pretty simple, actually. If you're just starting out, I think if you followed these 4 very high level points, you would be at a very good place to start. So document your organization's data classification. That's number 1. Make sure you involve those business teams when you're doing that. Have an external user strategy. Are you going to allow external users? If not, how are you going to prevent it? When are you going to allow external users? Number 3, enforce those policies. I talked about several of them today. There's many others as well. Lots of controls in the environment. I talked about kind of the big hitters today, but you can implement all of those based on the sensitivity classifications that you have set up. And last, but certainly not least, is educating your end users, which is critical in today's world. And because I found this interesting, this is how Microsoft enforces policy on their own teamwork. Not to say you have to do it like they do it, but it's very interesting to see the controls that they themselves have implemented for their very large organization. All right, I have a licensing slide. I won't stay on that. Another slide, I talked about the features I mentioned today, where they're at in rolling out, many of them coming very soon. There is a preview program on the bottom, aka.ms/SPO labels, for those sensitivity labels with protection for files that you may want to sign up for. All right, so please connect with me off hours and through any of those means. I blog a lot at joannecklein.com. Reach out to me via email or Twitter. And I just want to thank you all for joining me today. Thank you, ShareGate. I really appreciate it. And I don't know if we have time for any more questions. We've got maybe a few minutes left.
Yeah,
Ben,
I just had one or two questions, and then
okay.
I know you've covered a lot of content. And once again, thank you so much. We're already getting feedback that this was very helpful, which comes with two additional questions.
Okay.
Will the recording be available, and will the slides be available? And the answer is yes, early next week. We want to make sure that we go through the video, we take out some of the pieces that were said, and we write it as a piece of content you can consume however you prefer. So stay tuned. Early next week, we should send out the link to everyone who registered, and it'll be available on our blog. There were two quick questions. One was, can retention still just be applied to created and modified fields, or is it possible to add custom, say I have a contract end date field and I want to trigger it off of that?
A contract end date, there's a couple of ways you could do that. If you have the sufficient licensing, you can use event-based retention, and the event is when the contract is ended. Another way you could do it is if you use an auto apply based on a contract end date, and when it's in the past. I demoed that actually in my Ignite 7 ways to auto apply a retention label option. So that is just a keyword condition you put in the auto apply. Another way you could do it is through Microsoft Flow, because you can set, or Power Automate, I should say now. You can always set a retention label through an action in Power Automate. So that is another way you could do it. So a couple different ways.
And I think you have a blog, because actually that's the second question. It would be interesting to hear experiences of possibilities of using flows or Power Automate to auto apply retention labels. Or is that advanced e-discovery, or do you usually get tools? Or so I think I found, actually my colleague found a very detailed post that you have around using Flow to apply retention labels.
Yes, I've written a blog post on it. I forget the title right now. So yes,
we're going to post it on the Q&A.
Okay. Okay, awesome. Yeah, and that is something I think is a great way to do it, because if you don't have the licensing to do the auto apply, you can use Power Automate to do it instead. And you can basically add a retention label based on any kind of custom condition that you might have.
Very cool. And while I go at the very last question so far, somebody was wondering if you could bring back the licensing slide for a second, so they can look if what they're looking for is actually in their license model. Again, I'm passing through the many thanks that we're getting for your content and your time, Joanne. There is one question around Stream, and whether or not it's well covered in the Security and Compliance Center, and if they'll eventually be able to look at the transcripts and protect that as well, if you have any insights on those aspects.
I know I don't have a lot of insights. I do know right now they are not discoverable by e-discovery, and I'm not sure where that is on the roadmap. But to date, they are not discoverable. You would have to go to the actual stream video and do a search on each one for whatever it is you're looking for. So there needs to be some improvements in that one for sure.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Joanne. I really appreciate it. This was really a great, even for myself, learned a couple of things. And from what I can tell, it's the same for everyone. I want to respect everyone's time, including you, Joanne. Thank you very much. And have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you so much for having me. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye. Thank you.